We are boycotting French products to deliver a message economically, which is that the profit is a red line that cannot be crossed.
In Jordan, refrigerators were emptied of everything French, with large signs stuck on aisles. Calls for similar boycotts in other countries such as Saudi Arabia are circulating online. France, on the other hand, called for an end to the boycott. In a statement, the French Foreign Ministry said, and I quote, "These calls for boycott are baseless and should stop immediately, as well as all attacks against our country, which are being pushed by a radical minority," unquote. President Emmanuel Macron also doubled down on his defense of French values, saying that we will never give in. But with widespread calls of boycott growing, no country has declared an official boycott yet. We will only have to wait and watch to see if West Asian countries can go far enough to implement it. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is one.
It seems that the French President Emmanuel Macron has a tough challenge right in front of him. As the calls for boycott grow in the region, we will continue to bring you the latest updates from the heart of that conflict. But first, as always, let's take a look at what's making headlines across West Asia.
Lebanon and Israel hold another round of disputed maritime border talks. Hailed by Washington as a historic move, negotiations on border demarcation and offshore energy exploration continued in the southern Lebanese town of Naqoura. Reports suggest that the United States will move forward with the sale of F-35 fighter jets to the UAE, a move that could significantly change the military balance in the Gulf and affect Israel's military edge. Israel marked the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. 25,000 candles were lit during an annual memorial for Rabin in the square where he was killed in Tel Aviv. The U.S. Embassy in Dubai issues a warning to American citizens of a potential terror attack threat in the Gulf countries. In a statement on its website, the embassy asked all U.S. citizens to remain alert. Iran declared a full-scale war with coronavirus pandemic as rising death toll and surging infections overload a healthcare system weakened by U.S. sanctions.
Protesters in Iraq were met with tear gas and water cannons as they took to the streets to mark 1 year of anti-government protests. We take a look on how these protests began and why people continue to return to the streets even after a whole year.
A year on, Iraqi public's anger hasn't fully receded, even though last year's protests led to the ousting of Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi. Anti-government protests that erupted in Iraq a year ago lasted for several months before being crushed at the cost of 560 lives and 30,000 injured. The leaderless demonstrations against a political system deemed as corrupt then fizzled out. They were then overshadowed by tensions between the United States and Iran, which almost degenerated into an open conflict in Iraq. But again, several thousand Iraqis took to the streets of Baghdad a year after large-scale protests over corruption and a lack of basic services swept Iraq and toppled the government. The latest protests marked the first anniversary of the start of the popular protest on October 25, 2019. In the heart of Baghdad, Iraqis awoke to find blue and green-clad riot police fanned throughout central squares as concrete barricades blocked the gates to the heavily fortified green zone. Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has pledged that security forces would avoid the kind of harsh crackdown carried out during the months-long protest movement. but more than 500 protesters have already been killed.
We're simply demanding a homeland. That's it. There have been killings and bloodshed. Do they think we can't shed blood like them? But it's been 1 year and 20 days that we are saying that we are peaceful.
The October uprising, as it is known in Iraq, has become one of the largest grassroots movements in Iraq's modern history. As largely young crowds rallied first against corruption and lack of basic services, and later against the entire system of the sectarian politics, all of which have pushed the country to ruin.
We have renewed these protests because our demands have not been met. Demands we have been calling for over a year. So we decided to renew these marches by students in Basra. We'll keep going until our demands are met, including rounding up of all weapons by the government, implementing the party's law and independent elections.
But many of the protesters' grievances have since only worsened. Tanking oil prices in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic have left Iraq with an unprecedented liquidity crisis. Iran-backed militias that human rights groups blame for some of the worst violence during the protests last year are more empowered than before. And the United States and Iran have duelled more openly on Iraqi soil than in earlier years. Protests also occurred in Iraq's southern cities, but none on the same scale as in Baghdad. Hundreds of youth had travelled to the capital to join rallies there instead of at home. Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who took office in May after his predecessor was driven out by last year's unrest, has projected himself as a leader who supports the protesters and their demonstrations. But in practice, he has achieved little. Many Iraqis see their new premier as weak in the face of vested interests and growing militia power. West Asia Bureau, World is One.
On October 26th last year, ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed during a raid by the US Special Forces in northwest Syria. This was a major blow for the terrorist group. But 1 year after his death, how is the ISIS group coping with the death of one of its biggest leaders?
Bravo 1, the commandos are moving to my building, just so you know.
Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. And that's why he died like a dog. He died like a coward. He was whimpering, screaming, and crying.
The killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed caliph of the Islamic State, is not the end of the ISIS. But what ISIS becomes now is not clear either. Even when the US makes major military progress against a given movement, the group either recovers or some new form of terrorism emerges in its place. Politics is politics, but there are serious dangers in making claims about the ability to defeat terrorism in general and ISIS in particular. ISIS is no exception. It is still active in Syria, Iran, and other countries. Furthermore, US official intelligence and military reporting makes this all too clear, regardless of political claims to the contrary. So does the historical record. Just days after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in a raid by US Special Forces in October, the ISIS announced the name of the man who replaced him as leader. But the true identity of Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qureshi remains shrouded in mystery, and with it, the organization's strategy going forward. Trump claimed that he knew exactly who the successor was, but soon after that, senior US officials said that the new leader was completely unknown. Under Baghdadi, who also avoided the limelight, the ISIS experimented with running a proto-state, producing school textbooks and creating its own currency. Since the jihadist organization was driven out of its last patch of Syrian territory, the village of Baghouz, it resorted mainly to guerrilla tactics. If Qureshi is to avoid an international leadership challenge, he will be forced to step out of the shadows. The ability of terrorists and extremists to exploit the internet and global media remains a serious tool for terrorism and extremism that goes far beyond national boundaries and any given terrorist or extremist organization. After a 5-year absence from public view, al-Baghdadi had appeared April 29th in an 18-minute propaganda video. In a black tunic with a Kalashnikov rifle at his side, he stated that ISIS's fight against the West was far from over. The danger still looms large from al-Baghdadi's call to his followers to shift from larger attacks to smaller actions outside Iraq and Syria. Even so, al-Baghdadi's death, while partly symbolic, has silenced maybe the most inspirational terrorist voice that remained. West Asia Bureau Report, WION The World is One.
Clutching to their pickaxes and shovels, volunteers are now clearing up shrubs and dead trees that are growing up the walls of Syria's Crac des Chevaliers, one of the world's most famous Crusader castles. But it seems that the wildfires that are spreading in the region have now become a real problem for the centuries-old fortress. Our next report brings you more.
Clutching a small saw, a Syrian volunteer keeps cutting away at bushes that are growing on the centuries-old walls. This is Crac des Chevaliers, one of the world's most famous Crusader castles. Rana Rej was among the dozens working to clear grass, shrubs and dead trees from the UNESCO-listed fortress this week. To protect it from forest fires that have ravaged the region. Many of them were delighted to see the castle come back to life. After years of a grinding civil war that has kept almost all tourists away.
The castle is now recovering, and we can say that we moved one step in that direction. In 2018, the castle opened its doors to visitors and around 23,000 people visited it.
The fortress was built by a medieval Catholic military order, the Knights of St. John, who held it from 1142 to 1271. It was then captured by a Mamluk Sultan. Sitting atop a high ridge in what is now the Homs province of modern-day Syria, the castle could once accommodate a garrison of 2,000 men. When the civil war broke out in Syria in 2011, the fortress again became a battleground, this time between government forces and rebels. The most notable was the damage to the castle's Gothic reception hall and its chapel. In early 2018, the Syrian government attended a tourism trade fair in Madrid, seeking to bring back foreign visitors to the war-ravaged nation. But most countries advised their citizens against all travel to Syria, and tourists from abroad have been few and far between. However, in 2019, nearly 23,000 visitors visited the castle. The coronavirus pandemic this year has forced it back into isolation. UNESCO added Crac des Chevaliers to its World Heritage List in 2006, alongside Old Damascus and the ancient city of Palmyra. 2 years into the Civil War, it was put on the World Heritage in Danger list.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Now that the guns have fallen silent, another kind of danger stalks its fortified walls. Earlier this month, President Bashar al-Assad declared a national catastrophe after wildfires ravaged Syria's Mediterranean coastal belt. More than 400 volunteers have traveled to the fortress to clear vegetation and anything else that could catch fire.
The wildfires that had erupted in the area pushed us to make this initiative because they were everywhere. The wildfires were successfully put out on the 16th of this month. We were scared for the Krak der Chevalier, which is like a home to us. So we launched this initiative called the Week of History to clear the castle from weeds and dead trees that had mushroomed around it during the years of crisis in order to protect it.
9 years into the war, the government in Damascus is now back in control of more than 70% of Syria. Many look at this as a sign of hope for the return of tourists to the fortress, which misses its visitors. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
Even as much of their city remains in ruins, Iraqi artists are now erecting statues across the scarred city of Mosul, 3 years after the Islamic State group lost control over the city. These statues are now helping the residents shake off the memories of ISIS brutality. We take a look.
As the sunset nears in Iraq's Mosul, residents flock to a golden-tinted statue of a woman, one which looks over their scarred city with an expression of steady defiance. It is one of many works by local artists that have been erected across the northern Iraqi city since the Islamic State group lost control of it 3 years ago. The artworks are now helping residents shake off their memories of the brutal punishments meted out by the ISIS in the city squares. First erected in September 2018, My Lovely Lady was the first statue in a traffic circle where ISIS fighters beheaded or lashed residents who had broken its ultra-conservative rules.
The square where we built this statue was previously used by the Islamic State group to carry out the brutal crimes against the innocent people of the city, including slaughtering, cutting hands and flogging.
Interestingly, Ibrahim, who is the artist of this sculpture, created it in a secret basement studio, while the ISIS was still controlling Mosul. When the group first overran the city, they smashed works of art, musical instruments and age-old artifacts, labeling them as violations of their ultra-conservative views. They banned artists from working under the threat of death. This was a devastating blow to Mosul, which had been known for centuries as a hub for musicians, writers and artists. A favorite destroyed by ISIS was the Spring Girl, a young woman carrying a bouquet and buffeted by the wind. Mosul is known as the Mother of Two Springs because of its mild weather in both spring and autumn. A remake of the sculpture of a woman with flowing hair and a subtle half smile was erected this year against the backdrop of a bullet-riddled building, a reminder of Mosul's grim recent history.
This statue means civilization for the people of Mosul because it will become a statue against the Islamic State group. Those who destroyed the statues considered them as idols and did not want to leave any heritage in any of the streets of Mosul.
Little of Mosul's rich history is visible today. While the reign of destruction by ISIS ravaged the city, the grueling months-long fight to recapture it dealt another massive blow to its infrastructure. With only one public hospital currently functioning and poor power and water services, the crumbling buildings are the only reminder of a once vibrant city. But many residents look at the statues as reminders of a long-forgotten past, one they hope will bring Mosul back to life. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay home and stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, and you are watching WION World is One.